dúvidas sobre isso, mas é possível, faz-se, e sobretudo, e tem a ver com a questão da literacia mediática, quando os média são bem decifrados, podem ser fontes de informação e de conhecimento também extremamente valiosos. E essa tem sido uma das áreas de investigação do professor Elson, que tem tratado exatamente das respostas de comportamento de e com os meios de comunicação. Em 2014, numa prestigiada revista chamada European Psychologist, ele publicou um paper que eu utilizo muitas vezes com os meus alunos da disciplina de Violência e Média, no curso de Criminologia, que é um paper intitulado 25 anos de pesquisa sobre violência nos jogos digitais e sobre a agressão, onde ele fala exatamente dessa relação entre os jogos digitais e os comportamentos violentos das pessoas. A principal conclusão deste estudo, que faz uma pesquisa de 25 anos sobre esta matéria, é que é difícil tirar resultados perfeitamente claros numa relação direta entre aquilo que é o comportamento mais violento das pessoas e aquilo que são as imagens de violência que crescentemente estão presentes nesses mesmos jogos de vídeo, que é muitas vezes a tentação que há a fazer, que é de considerar que, sendo esses jogos muito violentos, os jovens, as crianças que os utilizam, possam vir a ter comportamentos igualmente violentos. Não há nenhum resultado absolutamente estável perante isso, mas, para nos falar disso melhor do que ninguém, o professor Malte Elson vai-nos aqui apresentar exatamente uma comunicação que procura refletir sobre essa matéria. No final, faremos aqui um pequeno debate, discussão. Podem perfeitamente colocar as vossas questões em português, se se sentirem mais confortáveis. Traduzirei para o professor Elson e ele responderá certamente com o conhecimento adquirido ao longo de vários anos nesta matéria. Apesar de ele ser ainda muito jovem, é já uma autoridade muito respeitada neste campo de conhecimento que é novo, mas muito interessante. So, Professor Elson, we are all listening to you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, which I assume was kind. And one of the challenges of this conference is that I wish I could attend more of the presentations, but I don't speak any word of Portuguese, which is a bit unfortunate, but maybe I'll come back and then I'll have some basic understanding then. Thank you for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to travel abroad for me because, as you can see in this picture, my university looks like an abandoned warehouse, and this university is very nice, both from the inside and the outside. So it's a pleasure for me to be here and to talk a little about some research that I have been doing, but also other people have been doing on the link between playing violent video games and aggressive or criminal behavior. I'll be talking about the science itself, the theoretical assumptions, some aspects regarding the methods of those studies, but then also a bit about the public discourse or the discourse within the scientific community about these effects. Whenever I talk about this topic, I really like to open with this quote, and I'll read it to you, in addition to having it here on screen. They arose in children's fantasies of sadistic joy in seeing other people punished over and over again, while you yourself remain immune. Moreover, they teach complete contempt of the police. I may say here on this subject there's practically no controversy. As long as the industry exists in its present form, there are no secure homes. There's an endless stream of brutality. I can only say that, in my opinion, this is a public health problem. I think it ought to be possible to keep children under 15 from seeing them displayed to them and preventing these being sold directly to children. If you think this is a quote about violent video games, you are mistaken. This quote was from a hearing at the US-American Senate in 1954, and it's about comic books. Comic books were 70 years ago a big scare, much like like video games were in the late 90s and early 2000s. And as you can see, at least the rhetoric is largely the same. And this is important to consider when talking about video game effects, because in that regard, there's nothing special about video games. We have been worried about a lot of things in the history of humanity. In the 2nd century, there was some interesting debate on whether being able to read might harm memory, because if everybody is able to read, then we don't have to memorize anything anymore. We can just write it down and forget about it because we know where we could pick up the information at a later point in time. Then in the 18th century, there was a very interesting discussion about women becoming interested in novels. Some European philosophers were worried that this would lead women to neglect the household, because they were books would keep them busy from looking after children, cleaning up, and so on. And there was some heated debate about whether they should be allowed to learn to read, or they should be allowed to have to own novels. Then in the 19th and 20th century, there was the sexualization of youth scare, particularly because of music and dances. And then about 1940, 1950, we started getting worried about media violence. Back then it was comic books and radio dramas and news, simple news reports that contained violence. And then obviously, as television became more and more popular, the debate turned to television effects, and then video games came along, and then was video game effects. Then a bit later, we had a scare about Nintenditis and physiological damage from playing too much, because people were holding the controllers all day and sitting like this in their chairs, and there was a scare that this might sustainably harm people, causing postural damage. Then we had some debate about digital dementia. So this is somewhat similar to the one from the 2nd century, where the availability of phones and the availability of search engines would cause us to forget things or not to remember things anymore, because we know how to look them up, so we don't have to memorize information anymore. And then recently there has been a huge debate on smartphone addiction and social media addiction. All of these topics are very interesting. I will today focus on the debate on media violence and aggression, particularly violent video games. So this literature can be, at least that's my idea, can be subsumed by presenting 3 dominant hypotheses that you could have about media violence and aggression. There's the behavior hypothesis, which states that there is some sort of causal connection between the two, either because of selection processes, which means that people that have a predisposition for violence select to play violent video games. So somebody that is already aggressive prefers violent media contents. And then obviously the other way around, playing violent video games increases the general aggression level in players. Then there's the incapacitation hypothesis, which basically states an inverse direction. So the more people play, the less violent they become. I'll be talking about the details about the underlying assumptions for this hypothesis. And then there's the inconsequential hypothesis, which just says that there is no link at all between the two. So let's talk about the first a little. What are the assumptions behind the behavior hypothesis, particularly behind the selection processes, that is, playing violent video games increases aggression in players? There are 2 important theories that you will see when you take a look at this literature. One is social learning theory from Bandura, and the assumption is quite simple. We know humans learn from observing other humans. This is something you can observe in babies and toddlers. When somebody does something, there's a chance that humans will pick this up and imitate the behavior, and particularly when humans see that somebody is being rewarded or punished for that behavior. So somebody, let's say somebody touching a hot stove and getting burned will, if I observe this happening and observe this person experiencing pain, there's a greater chance that I will not touch the stove right after, because I've seen that person being punished for that behavior, and the same is true for rewards. And basically, this theory, although when it was published in the 70s, it wasn't really, since then it has been applied to media in the sense that the idea is that you can learn the same way from observing avatars or figures in video games. So as you observe a human in a video game behaving in a certain way and being rewarded or punished for it, there's a greater chance you will pick up this behavior or not pick up this behavior. And then there's the cognitive neo-association theory, which is theory that is more concerned with memory, actually, and has been applied to media violence. And the idea is basically that the more violence you observe in everyday life, the stronger the connections in your memory become, and the more available these things are to you. So, for example, aggressive behavior as a solution to problem solving becomes more available to you as you encounter problems in everyday life. And the assumption here is, again, that it doesn't even have to be presented as something that is rewarded or punished. The mere image of violence itself is sufficient. There's a pretty famous study from the 60s, so-called weapon effect, where the authors said they observed this particular effect by just showing people a gun. They just placed a gun on a table in the center of a room, and voila, everybody exposed to this gun, although they didn't touch it or behave with it in a certain way, became more aggressive from that mere observation. Okay, so these are the assumptions behind that particular effect, and let's for a moment pretend they are true. If they were true, then I think it's reasonable to say that violent video games could have these effects. Many games feature violent contents. We have entire genres, basically, that consist of violence or fighting. First-person shooters, several strategy games are pretty violent, and even some sports games contain pretty graphical amounts of violence. Some games are about criminal behavior specifically, even. The entire Grand Theft Auto series is based on the idea that you play as a criminal in a large city. So if these assumptions that I just told you about were true, then yes, games could contribute to aggressive and criminal behavior. How do we go and look for evidence to either confirm these hypotheses or falsify them? I think there are three major strains of studies that go into this topic. One is biographic research or retrospective studies. For example, you select a sample of people that you know behaved violently in the past. For example, prison inmates that were being sentenced for some sort of violent crime, and you ask them about their media habits that they had when they were younger. So you take a sample that you know acted violently later in life and ask them whether they had a preference for violent media earlier in life. The problem with this approach is, well, it's retrospective, so it doesn't help you proving causality in the sense that even if all of these individuals had a stronger preference for violent media, this wouldn't tell you much about whether these are the causes of the violent behavior later in life. And further, there's a bit of a problem with predicting an extremely rare behavior, and committing a crime is, on the face of the population, a relatively rare behavior, with an extremely common behavior, which is playing video games. So, for example, about 25% of the German population are video game players, and something like 95% of 14 to 18-year-old males are video game players. So even if you would find that all of these, let's say, inmates had a preference for violent video games, this wouldn't really tell you much because many people play violent video games in their youth. So this is a challenge of this type of research, and it won't really help you establish causality, which is what you want to know. Then there's a, I want to say, silver standard, at least in this field. This is considered a silver standard, and it's much less common in psychology, more common in criminology, which is observational research. So basically the idea is that we observe trends in, for example, violent video gameplay and criminal behavior, and if A causes B, then B should go up as A goes up. So these numbers are publicly available, more or less. We have sales figures for violent video games. We know how much they are bought, at least, and we also have some reasonable assessment of how much they are played, because game companies advertise with the hours or the amount of time spent on these games. And then, of course, the official records for criminal behavior that you can obtain from some governmental agency. And you can simply see whether there's any link between the two. And then you'll sometimes see graphs like this one. This is a somewhat famous graph from a study from Ferguson. And you can see that there's not really a link between the two. These red bars are video game units sold in millions, and then the blue line is youth violence rates. And as you can see, the two are not really related. Of course, again, this is not proving causality in any way or form. This is merely correlational. We see that, at least in the US, where these data are from, there's no really an obvious link between video games units sold and how much crime young people commit. And therefore, because these data are correlational, right? They're just two events happening simultaneously, but there's no obvious reason why they should be connected in any way. They really shouldn't be used as evidence for any of the three hypotheses that I tried to show you earlier. It is entirely possible that despite these trends, video games could be a cause of aggression. For example, it's possible that if it weren't for violent video games, the blue line would go even stronger, would go downwards even stronger. And it's possible that there are other reasons that cause this decline of youth rates, while the video game effect, whatever it is still in place. We also don't know who is buying these games, actually, right? So the assumption of these two data types being connected is that it's the same people. But who buys video games? We can assume that it's the same people that commit crimes, but maybe it's just not the case, and so the two cannot be related in any way. Generally, in this line of research, I want to say we do not observe an appreciable link between, let's say, weekly sales and criminal behavior. I mean, these were just annual sales, but you can have a greater granularity and look at weekly sales, and even then you don't see any type of connection. There are some stronger links, for example, with drug use. This is, again, not saying that there's a causal link, but as violent video game consumption goes up, so does drug use in the US for whatever reason, but not violent crimes. Interestingly, there's some pretty remarkable research by criminologists in the US that look at specific dates when popular video games are published. So for example, when a new GTA comes out or a new Call of Duty comes out, they look at violent crimes right after the publication of these games, and you see that they drop substantially. And this is explained with the incapacitation hypothesis. So who commits crimes? It's mostly young men. And who plays violent video games? It's also mostly young men. So when you're busy playing a violent video game, you cannot be on the street committing a crime at the same time. So there's this effect, which is relatively short, I would say. There's good evidence for this effect that whenever a new popular title hits the market, people are busy playing games and don't have the capacity to commit crimes at the same time, but this dissipates relatively quickly. The gold standard in psychological research to establish causality is the experiment. And this is what I want to say 80% of this literature or so consists of. The most studies in this area are experiments, for better or for worse. How do these experiments usually work? There's a gold standard design, so to say. You have one group being assigned to play a violent video game. You have another group being assigned to play a non-violent video game. Afterwards, you measure aggression and you compare these two groups with each other. And the assumption is that if violent games cause aggression, then the people you randomly assign to play a violent game should be more aggressive afterwards than the people who played the non-violent game. I'm not going to go into detail about this left part of this graph. I'll be mostly talking about this right part, which is the more difficult part. How do you measure aggression in an experiment? Right? With observational data, it's easy. We know when somebody has committed a violent crime because there's some kind of police record that has documented it. But how do you measure aggression in a laboratory? There are ethical and legal boundaries to your research. You can't actually have people hit each other or anyone. You're not allowed to risk yourself or people collecting data or even the subjects themselves, as you're not allowed to provoke actual aggression by which they could hurt themselves. Which means you can't actually study the type of behavior that you're definitely interested in. And so there are some, I want to say, creative abstractions of aggression that are more common in this literature. And consequently, the research is less conclusive than some might suggest or some might wish it was. Because if you can't study aggressive behavior directly, but only some indirect versions of it, obviously the research is not that informative to your research question. Giving you a few examples now. One research question that you will see in the literature is, does playing video games increase aggressive thinking? So this is not even about behavior, this is just whether people somehow view the world more aggressively, whether aggression or violence is on their mind constantly. And again, thinking is extremely difficult to measure. You can ask people, what are you thinking right now? But there's a good chance that people will not tell you because they're not able to or because they don't want to. Lying is a big problem in self-report, particularly when you try to assess something that is not desirable, right? Because people would be, there's a good, it's reasonable to suggest that people might be lying when you ask them, are you aggressive right now? So instead of doing that, or as a lack of a better alternative, researchers have turned to so-called automatic semantic associations, which is not thought itself, but more how accessible certain topics are to you right now. And the way they do this is with a usually with a so-called word completion task, and it works like this. So again, imagine you have the setup, you have assigned some people to play a non-violent video game, you have assigned some people to play a violent video games, and afterwards you show all of them a series of incomplete words, like this one, and you ask them to complete it for you. So which letters are missing? And the trick is that each word can be resolved with a violent and a non-violent connotation. So for example, you could resolve this word stem to mean the word kiss, which would be the non-violent version, or it could also be the word kill. And the idea is that if it was true that playing violent video games increases aggressive thinking, you would expect those people to think more of these violent solutions to these words. Now, you don't have to be experimental psychologists to recognize that this is not really useful. This is not what we want to know, right? It's not surprising that if you just played a game where you killed people, that the word kill would be on your mind. I mean, in the same sense, if you just played a game about kangaroos, the word kangaroo would definitely be on your mind without you wanting to be a kangaroo or having some kind of weird preference for kangaroos. This is just how things work. And so concluding from this that there's some sort of effect on your thinking style or your preference or your intentions or whatever you want to call it is probably not a correct inference to be made. And anyway, we don't really care about, I mean, it's reasonable to care about what people think, but when we talk about the link between violent media and aggression, we are interested in whether people act aggressively as a consequence of having played these games too much. This is also what drives the public and scientific debate. You'll see this whenever another tragic shooting at a school occurs. The debate returns to the effects of violent media. Again, it's extremely difficult to study aggressive behaviors. And again, this hasn't really stopped people from doing it. They just came up with some interesting approximations of aggressive behavior. For example, there's the voodoo doll task, where, again, this is the same setup. Some people play a violent video game, some people play a non-violent video game, and afterwards, they are given a voodoo doll, a little doll and some needles, and they are told, this represents your opponent that you played the game against earlier. And then the idea is that more aggressive people would use more needles to stick into the doll. There's the dart throwing task, where people are given two dart boards, and one has a picture of an object in the center, like, I don't know, a hat maybe, or a laptop, or whatever, something neutral. And then the other board has a picture of a person. And the idea is that when you're more aggressive, you are more inclined to throw darts at the person as opposed to the object. There's the hot sauce paradigm, where subjects are being asked to prepare a bowl of chili con carne for someone in the next room, and they are given a selection of hot sauces, so varying from very mild to very hot. And the idea is that if they are aggressive, they intentionally pick the really hot sauce and add lots and lots of it, because this will make the food more difficult to eat for someone else. And then there's the competitive reaction time task, where after having played a violent video game, they play another game against someone that is being described as a reaction time game. So they have to push a button really fast after seeing a signal, and the loser of a round gets punished with unpleasant noise blast, like scratching on a chalkboard or something. And again, the idea is that if people are aggressive, they make these noises louder and longer for the other person. Of course, again, you don't have to be an experimental psychologist to see that we're not worried about adolescents sticking needles in voodoo dolls. We're not worried about them throwing darts at people's photographs. We're not worried about people putting hot sauce on strangers' food, nor that they send noise blasts to others. This is all not really what we set out to study, right? This is not really an answer to the research questions, do violent video games cause aggression? Even if they somehow caused all these things to happen, how does this transfer to real life? How does this inform us about the question that we actually have? What do we learn about the link between violent video games and aggression from these studies? There's vast disagreement among researchers regarding the validity of these procedures. Are they measuring what they're supposed to do? Are these even measures of aggression? Is it more aggressive to stick a needle into a voodoo doll than not doing so? I find this very difficult to answer. How reliable are they? How precise are they in their measures? For example, is it not possible that when people send an unpleasant noise blast to another person, that they're more competitive because this is a reaction time game, and maybe they're just trying to deter the other person from being faster than them? And there's disagreement how to correctly analyze those data. So what have these studies told us, in fact? We'll come to that later. But regardless of what they have told us, researchers have made extreme claims in the literature about what we know about these effects. For example, Anderson and colleagues have several papers where they state that the effects of media violence on aggression are as large as the effects of drug use, abuse by parents, and poverty on aggression. Or that the effects of media violence on aggression are as large as the effect of smoking on lung cancer. I'm not even sure how to interpret that comparison, because the two domains are very different. You either have lung cancer or you don't. There's no degree of lung cancer. And of course, measures of lung cancer aren't weird self-report scales where you have to rate whether you have a lung cancer or not. There's an objective test. And so I'm not even sure how to compare these two very different research areas with each other. There's more. There's a paper where it says that media violence is responsible for 30% of all societal violence, which seems like a very large number, even if you think that media violence has some contribution to that. It's also some kind of the inverse. People are hypothesizing what would happen if we were to ban all media violence. And according to this paper from 1992, so this was more about television violence, it would prevent 10,000 murders, 70,000 cases of sexual abuse, and 700,000 physical assaults annually in the US alone. It's just, again, it seems like very, very large numbers. And then there's also some debate among scientists. So for example, there are several papers where it says that denying the effects of media violence or questioning them has the same credibility as denying that the Holocaust occurred, which again kind of seems like to come from a different domain, because one is documented and the other is a matter of scientific discourse. Of course, there are also extreme counterclaims. So for example, researchers saying that in video games cause aggression are maintaining an empirical illusion to support their personal beliefs. So they intentionally lie about the science because they have some preformed opinion of the topic. Or that media violence is corrupted by the pressure to publish instead of being objective. or that believing that violent video games are responsible for crime is like the belief witches are responsible for bad weather. Again, I find inappropriate for scientific discourse. So what do we know? What do we know? What have we learned about the three hypotheses? Some general remarks about the behavior hypothesis. I think it is clear that violent media, if they contribute to aggression, they cannot have a large effect, because if that was true, we would have to see a massive spike in most industrialized nations where violent media are extremely popular, and we don't. Conversely, we see a continuous decline of violence rates in almost all Western societies or industrialized societies. And so I find it implausible to say that these effects exist regardless. They're somehow not visible, but they're actually there. And so if the effects exist, I think it's fair to say they must be small at best. I think there's some evidence for the selection effect, so that people with a disposition for violence prefer violent media. I think this is based on the literature, is a reasonable hypothesis to have, and it looks like this might be an interesting line of research to consider. The quality of evidence for the socialization, on the other hand, is questionable. So the idea that playing violent video games increases violent dispositions. I think based on the research methods that we see used in that literature, I wouldn't bet too much on that. That's not to say that the effect isn't true. It could be there. It's just that we don't know because of the way we chose to study the topic. What about the incapacitation hypothesis? So the idea that there's some kind of negative link between the two. Maybe, but again, the effect is probably small. I think I find the argument that as people are busy playing violent video games, they don't have the capacity to commit a crime. I find that appealing, but I also think that if this effect is true, then it's going to last only for very, very small amounts of times. It's also not really a solution to the problem. We can't have people keep busy playing violent video games instead of committing crime. So maybe there's something to it. It kind of depends on what you think is a relevant effect. And this brings me to the third hypothesis. Inconsequential. Is there any link between the two? And this really depends on your definition of inconsequential. To me, if the effect, let's assume there is an effect, but it's extremely small, to me, this would be inconsequential. If the effect is so small that you don't really observe it, that it might be there, but it doesn't really affect crime rates in an interesting or appreciable way, then it's almost as being no effect at all. And so it's impossible to prove there's absolutely no relationship between two variables in psychology. But again, if the largest effect you can come up with isn't really observable in, let's say, crime rates or other relevant types of behaviors that you're able to record, then I think it's fair to say, or it's a reasonable position to have that it's inconsequential in effect. This is frustrating. This research has been going on for approximately 30 years on video games, and then before that there were another 20 or so on television, so it's more than 50 years of research with hundreds or thousands of studies. And we haven't really learned much, and this is frustrating, at least to me. I think if researchers want to contribute to that question, to the societal understanding of that research, or of that topic, so to say, then they need to change their ways. Roughly 50 years of research have cost an enormous amount of resources. They had very little impact on policy. There's no country that consults researchers in their policy decision-making on media violence. It's all based on moral foundations of countries, which is fair. But I think if researchers would be able to a reasonable degree, prove or at least provide credible evidence that there is a strong effect, countries or governments were advised to take them at their word, but unfortunately they don't. And also, the research has little predictive value in the sense that if the scare from the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s were true, we would have to see some sort of effect coming down on us any moment, but it hasn't happened yet. I hope that in the future, researchers make some substantial decisions regarding their research practices, which is that they should make their data available so they can be analyzed by many people and not just one or two that happen to publish a paper on it. I hope that they increase their transparency and accountability in the sense that they explain why they chose to study a topic in a certain way. Why did they choose? How do they justify choosing measuring aggression with, levels of hot sauce? I think they should increase the robustness of their methodology. We need to be better if we want to provide a credible answer. I also hope that we start being more transparent of the research process overall, and that we register our hypotheses and study designs in advance of collecting data. This is a bit more, maybe for later on for the discussion, an interesting topic. And finally, the science communication, both within the community and the general public, needs to be calm and responsible and factual, even if it means that the answer is we don't know yet. Thank you very much.